said to James, one of the things that I said to James the other day is that today, when we're on the podcast, I'm going to be talking about, in general, the benefits of ranked choice voting. Tomorrow, when we're meeting with TPPF, I'm going to be talking about the benefits of ranked choice voting for conservatives. So a little different story. There's nothing that I will explicitly contradict, but in a general podcast, I don't really want to advocate for ranked choice voting as a benefit only for conservatives, but that's really my focus tomorrow.
No, I think we should lay down arguments for both sides. Why does it benefit conservatives and progressives?
Right.
So,
right. And that's what today is. But tomorrow I don't have to bring up why it also benefits progressives. Although I would be really happy if both major parties used ranked choice voting and nominated the best candidates with broad voter support, because chances are those are candidates I will more likely support than some of the strange people who get nominated by both parties these days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point. Episode 60 is a discussion on alternative voting methods, including ranked choice voting, with Harriet Wasserstrum and James Quintero. Harriet is the chair of ranked choice voting for Texas, and James is the director of the Center for Local Governance at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, one of America's premier conservative think tanks. And he's also the author of The Case Against Ranked Choice Voting research paper, which was published by the Texas Public Policy Foundation recently. So it would be helpful to first do an overview of our existing voting system before we dive into the alternative voting methods. So America has, in most elections, plurality voting system, which means that a candidate who polls more than any other candidate gets the highest percentage of votes is elected, regardless of if he received a majority or not. I think that's how most elections work. Am I correct, or would you say that it's different?
So in Texas, we use plurality voting for statewide offices and in special elections. But for primaries, where we really select the candidates that will run in the general elections, we do what's called a two-round runoff. So we really divide up by type of election the voting system that we use.
So Texas has open primaries, which means that regardless of your party affiliation, you can vote in any party primary you like. And if a candidate in the primary does not receive a majority vote, then there is another election called a runoff election, where the two candidates who scored highest in the primary advance to, and people have to go and vote again, which is not the most, I would say, cost-effective way to hold elections, right? And
well, you're right, Lucy, and thank you both for having us on. This is a really important discussion on, I think, something of a novel concept that is beginning to gain a little traction here in Texas, at least in the public policy circles that I kind of frequent. And so it's interesting to look at some of these new approaches, and I'll be the first to admit that, a runoff election tends to have a bit smaller of a selection when it comes to the number of voters turning out to make their decision made. But while the voting pool may be a little smaller, I think I'm on safe grounds saying that we're at least, I think, in a little better shape having a head-to-head match up where voters can make one of two selections and everybody's vote counts under that system.
So I think that everyone's vote counts under both systems, and the fact that usually runoff elections attract 40% fewer voters. So the final determination is being made by a much smaller pool of voters. And the fact that not in a ranked choice voting election, not everyone has ranked enough candidates to stay in the multiple tallies that may occur. That's no different than having people not show up for a runoff election. So if I vote in a ranked choice voting election and only rank 2 candidates and both of them get eliminated, and we really should go into how ranked choice voting works. Mm-hmm. But if I only rank 2 candidates and my candidates get eliminated, then I'm no longer in the running, but my vote has counted the same way as a voter who votes in a primary election and does not bother to show up for the runoff. So it's really no different. And in fact, if runoff elections get participated in by 40% fewer candidates, which tends to be the average in the United States, that's a far larger drop-off of people whose votes don't count than in a typical ranked choice voting election, where 10% or 12% of the ballots get exhausted. But we're using terminology now that probably should get defined. So maybe we should talk about what is ranked choice voting, how does it work, and then we can get into, I will start by saying no voting system is perfect. And Nobel laureate economists have proven that you cannot have a perfect voting system. So my contention relative to ranked choice voting is I would not support it for every type of election in Texas. And I would not necessarily implement it the way Alaska has in conjunction with open primaries. But I would like to look at type of election by type of election, see which ones really would be improved by using ranked choice voting, and then try it in Texas. So with that, can we do some definitions?
Let's do it, yeah.
Okay, so do you want to go, James, or do you want me to keep talking?
Go ahead, okay. You take the lead.
So ranked choice voting is really a non-partisan change in voting logistics. And it only comes into play if you have an election and no one receives a majority. If you have an election, regardless of the number of candidates in it, if one candidate receives a majority, that's it, you're done. If no candidate receives a majority, then you go into the specialized ranked choice voting tallying. The way that works is you eliminate the candidate who has received the fewest votes, and you look to each vote that candidate received, and then that vote gets counted for each voter's second choice.
I just want to mention, when you say votes, you mean first choice votes.
First choice votes. That's what when you have a ranked choice voting election, what you first do is you look at first choice votes. Does anyone have, thank you for the clarification. Does anyone have a majority? If no one has a majority, let's go through ranked choice voting and include the backup preferences of each voter. So you first eliminate the candidate who received the fewest votes, and you look to each ballot that had that guy as first choice, see who that voter's second choice was, and count that ballot to their second choice. So that's how it works. You do that, you look to see, does someone now have a majority of the votes? If not, then you eliminate the next lowest vote getter. And you do that until someone has a majority of the remaining votes. And it's very important to think of it as the remaining votes. One of the contentions that ranked choice voting advocates made initially was you always get a majority winner. Well, it's not necessarily a majority of all of the voters in that election. It's a majority of the remaining active ballots. And that essentially is what happens today in our current voting system. The guy who wins in a runoff election needs to get a majority of the people who showed up in the runoff. And that might only be 60% of the number of people who showed up in the first election. So it's really interesting that both sides like to criticize the other, but often for the same things that each side is doing.
I have some stats on the primaries, as you mentioned. The turnout last year was 18% of about 17 million registered voters in Texas. And in the runoff, the turnout was about 8%. So that's even more than the 60% that you say.
Right. And it's an average. It depends a lot on not just on is it a ranked choice voting election or not a ranked choice voting election, but who are the candidates? What are the big issues? Turnout in general is really hard to forecast by voting system. It's more easy to forecast it based on how contentious is the election. Is it being held on a November date or a spring date? There are other factors that go into turnout. James, it looked as though you were about to say something.
Oh, well, I think you guys are right to highlight the broad voter apathy that exists, because I think we can all agree that not enough voters participate in elections. One of the things I worry about with RCV is just how complicated the process is, though. And if you look at some of the some of the anecdotal evidence that exists out there, I think what RCV could potentially do is exacerbate the problems, make the process more complicated. And one of the points that I'd direct you to is in Maine, where they instituted RCV a few years back. The elections administrators there had to publish a manual for voters on how to engage with the system, and it was a 19-page document. And so, I would just caution the audience from jumping in headfirst into this concept, because it does come with a lot of complication that could potentially turn off voters and exacerbate the voter apathy issue.
So when you mention complexity, you're looking at it from the voter side, not the counting side.
Well, I think there's complexity on both ends.
Ends.
One of the good things that I get to do around here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation is envision the ideal, right? What does the ideal election system look like? And I think broadly speaking, from my standpoint at least, it's simple and secure, right? We want a system that voters can easily engage with, and then on the back end, that election administrators can make sure that every vote counts, and that there are not a lot of election irregularities. And I can tell you, having seen the monster up close, the system that we have in place today has its advantages and disadvantages. But I think on net is a good system. And when you consider something with the sort of complexity that comes with RCV, I think those elements get worse, particularly on the election administration side. But Harriet, you might have thoughts otherwise.
So it's easy to get influenced by anecdotal information, but systematic research that's been done after elections that use ranked choice voting, the overwhelming majority of voters say it was simple to use and they want to use it again. And you see that in Alaska, you see that in New York City, you see that in Utah. It's really not that difficult. And people say, see, it's just like going into an ice cream store and they don't have your favorite and you go to your second favorite. That's a silly analogy, but it really is true. It's not a complex process. And voters who use it say they like it and want to use it again. So I really think that is something that gets overstated in the media that does not support ranked choice voting by saying it's complicated. It's really not complicated. Now, would I ever say that every voter studies every candidate to make an informed decision about all the candidates? No. A lot of voters don't even do that today. They just go with the party. But I think, the goal is to have informed voters. In a ranked choice voting election, you do not have to rank all of the candidates. Usually, in fact, you're limited to 3 or 4 or 5 of choices. But then that just means you have more influence in the final outcome. So I really would not agree that it's more complicated.
One thing that I noticed in Harris County, and I believe this was in November 2022, they had a ballot that measured about 10 pages with 100 different races on that particular measure, right? And so, I wonder how much more complicated the Harris County elections would have been had voters also been required to fill in all of these different preferences. And I actually even wonder whether it's manageable at all. And one thing to note about Texas's local election scene is that we have nonpartisan elections here in Texas at the local level. So you don't have those partisan identifiers affiliated with each of your candidates. So that would mean that your voter would have to have some additional level of knowledge about the races that they're deciding, or just guess outright, I guess. I think it adds an additional challenge for some of Texas's larger communities.
So I smiled when you talked about the length of the Harris County ballot, since I live in Harris County. That's a whole separate subject. We should not be electing judges, and that would greatly shorten the size of the ballot, but we're not going to talk about that right now. I also, as I said earlier, I don't think that ranked choice voting should be used in every type of election. I think we should pick and choose and use it where it really provides benefit in excess of any problems that may arise because of using it.
Which type of elections would you not use it for?
Well, again, I wouldn't do any elections for judges, but for judges, I probably would not advocate ranked choice voting. First of all, in most judicial races, you don't have more than 2 candidates, so there's no ranked choice voting involved. You only use ranked choice voting if there are 3 or more candidates. I would definitely want to use ranked choice voting for special elections. When there's a vacancy in a legislative body that needs to be filled, we now hold a special election. The poster child for an example of where ranked choice voting really would have helped was in 21, when the congressperson from Dallas's 6th district passed away, and there were 23 people who threw their hat in the ring saying, "I'd like that job." Well, if you have 23 people, this was not a ranked choice voting election. This was a plain first past the post. It was a 2-round runoff election. The top 2 vote getters, between the 2 of them, had 1/3 of the votes. So we know, and the guy who eventually won is a wonderful congressman. So I really, don't like to say anything bad about, I'm not saying anything bad about him, but between the 2 of them, they had 1/3 of the votes, which means that two-thirds of the voters did not have any influence on who was going to get elected. The runoff election had half as many people participate as in the initial election. So the guy who won, by definition, if you have 2 people in a runoff election, 1 person will have a majority. Well, his majority was only 25% of the initial ballots. That is not a broadly supported candidate. So I think special elections, and the other real benefit of special election is if you had an instant runoff, you would not have to wait until you could hold a runoff election, and you could fill the vacancy much more quickly. So I think special elections would be wonderful to have ranked choice voting. My other real favorite is for military and overseas voters. I don't think that our military voters should be disenfranchised by delays in receiving ballots for runoff elections. 6 southern states use ranked choice voting so that their military voters can vote once. And what they do is the overseas voter gets 2 ballots, one that looks exactly like the one that the people back home in Alabama or in Arkansas get, and one that's a ranked choice voting ballot. They fill them out initially. They mail both of them back in the same envelope, and they're done. In the event of a runoff, so initially, the election administrator back home only opens the ballot that looks like everyone else's. If there is a runoff, they then open the ranked choice voting ballot. And you can see how each voter ranked all the candidates. And depending on who's in the runoff election, you can know which one the voter would have preferred. And it's done. So you don't have the election administrator's nightmare of remailing ballots overseas. You don't have to, the military people I've spoken to say they never felt confident that their votes actually got back in time in a runoff election. So that to me is a really easy change, and we should not be disenfranchising military voters by delays in receipt of ballots. The other nice thing that Georgia accomplished last year was by implementing ranked choice voting for military and overseas voters, they were able to accelerate the date of their runoff election. So again, everyone back home needed to participate in a runoff election. According to federal regulations, you cannot have that runoff election in a very short time frame because they're trying to get the overseas people enough time to receive their runoff ballots. But now you didn't have to send the runoff ballots to your overseas people, so you could accelerate the date of the runoff election. So if you remember in 2020, there were 2 US Senate races that all of us around the country sat there until January wondering, would the Senate go Republican or would it go Democrat, depending on what happened in the scheduled January runoff. In 2022, when we had the same situation, that runoff election was held in December. You can accelerate the date of the runoff. And that's something that lots of people in Texas talk about, that they would like to be able to know sooner who is actually going to be on the ballot in the general election. So that's another great example of where ranked choice voting would help.
You know, I'd be curious to hear how you might respond to this. You know, I think you do make a good point with respect to the date of the election, but it's my understanding that certain jurisdictions that have implemented ranked choice voting, and I'll point to Oakland, for example, where you have, in some cases, election contest undergoing 9 different rounds of redistributing the vote as they kind of work through the system. And so the date of the election may be certain, but the election outcome and knowing that election outcome is certainly not, because of the complication of the process.
So I'm not familiar specifically with Oakland, but I am familiar with what happened in New York City when they first implemented ranked choice voting for their primaries a few years ago. The biggest delay in calculation was due to rules that had been set up by the Board of Elections, saying that voters had, for mail-in ballots, had a week past the election day to send in their ballots. And then they had another week after that. If there was a problem with the ballot, they could contest it. So that is what caused the delay. Computers are pretty fast. You can churn through all of those tallies in no time at all. Often what a municipality will do, and it's mostly municipalities that use ranked choice voting today, is that they slow down the process just so people have a chance to absorb what's going on. But computers are fast. You can do an instant runoff instantaneously and get the results, assuming that that's consistent with what the Board of Elections has set up as the rules that the election should follow. And with ranked choice voting, you do need to wait until all of the ballots have been received, because until all of the ballots have been received, you don't know who the lowest vote getter is, who you would want to eliminate. But if the rules are set up that ballots need to be received and processed by the election administrators by election day, that totally changes the picture. So I agree with you. People like responses. You know, we live in a computer age. Like, why are you taking so long? I need to know this yesterday. But you really can accelerate the results. You do not have to wait for an overseas vote to be received.
Good point. Harriet, what do you think about the Alaska system of top 5 in the primary, nonpartisan primary, and then that the top 5 candidates get advanced to the general election, which happens through ranked choice? Do you think this is the ideal system with ranked choice voting, or would you do it differently?
I am a realist. I live in Texas. Texas loves its political parties. And Texas needs to get any electoral change approved by the current legislature. There is no way that open primaries will be approved by the people we have currently elected to the legislature. So whether or not I think that's a better idea, we're not advocating for it. We are advocating for ranked choice voting by itself, because by itself, it can have a positive impact. And some of the problems that that have been articulated in newspaper and other articles really relate to the open primary part of what was going on in Alaska, rather than the ranked choice voting part. That is not what we're talking about here. We are talking about ranked choice voting to be implemented by itself so that both parties can separately nominate the best candidates who will then go on and compete in the general election. So did I tap dance around your question well enough?
Yeah.
And Lucy, just to give kind of everybody a little bit of the state of play here in Texas, back, I want to say in 2003, then Attorney General Greg Abbott issued an advisory opinion finding that cities or political subdivisions, more broadly, could not implement ranked choice voting like election systems. And that was kind of, that came shortly after then Attorney General Henry Cuellar issued a similar finding. And there was a lot of interest back in the early 2000s in maybe transitioning to a new model. And so that's kind of been the state of play for a long time. And then in 2021, the city of Austin decided to kind of make a new move in a new direction. And so it offered up, I believe it was Proposition E, to Austin voters, kind of asking whether or not they wanted to move to, a similar type system. And so following the passage of that proposition, there was a lot of interest at the Texas legislature in perhaps making explicit in state law that cities couldn't do this on their own, that we were going to have one uniform type system across the state so as not to confuse voters with different pockets of different election systems. And so that resulted in the near passage of Senate Bill 921 this session that would have made it clear that political subdivisions had to adhere to kind of the state uniform standard. Ultimately, that bill didn't make it across the finish line, but I can tell you that there has been a lot of interest in this issue. And I assume in the near future, there's probably going to be another legislative push to make it clear in state law what Attorney Generals Abbott and Cuellar have already determined from a legal standpoint.
So the history is that in 2001, the Secretary of State reacted to a move by Austin to use ranked choice voting for city elections. And then that was confirmed by Abbott, who was then Attorney General in 2003. And Cuellar and Abbott said that the way ranked choice voting gets to a majority winner is not what is envisioned in the Texas election code, because they say a majority is first choice ballot. The reallocation of votes based on backup choices really doesn't constitute majority voting as envisioned by the Texas election code. So it was that specific complaint that they had that put Austin's move to ranked choice voting back in the early 2000s on hold. And then, as you said, in 2021, Austin thought they'd try again. And Proposition E says, we will use ranked choice voting for city elections once it becomes legal by the state. So there was no effort to buck the state this time. They just wanted the legislature to know that they are waiting, and as soon as the state approves it, their voters have agreed that they want to use ranked choice voting. So slightly different story than what had happened 20 years earlier. And there are several other, both cities and some small towns and some school districts that are interested in raising their hands and saying, we too would like to be early adopters. What happened with Senate Bill 921 this year was really a reaction to what the Republican National Committee published in January of 2023. There were 9 policies that were being advocated for by the Republican National Committee. And this was the meeting at which Ronna McDaniel had the opportunity to be reappointed as head of the Republican National Committee. And that was the second item on the agenda. The first item on the agenda was, let's vote on these 9 policies. We have no time for discussion. You have to vote for all of them up or all of them down. And that's when the Republican National Committee, even though there were people in the audience, Republicans, conservatives who are using ranked choice voting and like it, they had no opportunity to explain why they like it or in which types of elections they would like to see it being used. So 921 was really a reaction to the RNC move earlier this year. And we're hoping that that really goes away. A lot of states wound up introducing bills to ban ranked choice voting in all elections in their state. In most states where that legislation was introduced, it was not passed. It was passed, I believe, in 2 more states. And there had been
Florida and Tennessee, I believe.
Florida and Tennessee had it in place last year. This year, we added South Carolina and Idaho, I think. I might not have that right. Montana was also in the running. But several other states considered bills like that, and then they died. So I'm hoping that as we continue to educate voters and legislators about the benefits of ranked choice voting, and if I like the idea of ranked choice voting in special elections, that doesn't mean I want it in every general election going forward. And the nice thing about our voting systems is that they are set by the state. And different states can try different things, and something that works in one state might not be appropriate for another state. And let's see what makes sense, because there are, our United States is a great democracy, and there are lots of benefits about the way we have voted for hundreds of years. But that doesn't mean that incremental change should not be attempted. So.
A good point. You talked about benefits. Can you lay out the general benefits of ranked choice voting and then specifically the benefits for conservatives?
So I think James should talk about the benefits of ranked choice voting. No, I'm just kidding. So the biggest benefit in my mind is that in elections that are held with ranked choice voting, the winners have broad voter support. Not necessarily a majority of the people who voted, but broad voter support. And I use the example of the Texas Congressional District 6 as an example of a special election, which to me is a poster child of where we should use ranked choice voting. I've got one of those for a primary. So Virginia is a great example of the benefits of ranked choice voting. So Virginia in 2021, the Republican Party needed to nominate candidates for statewide office. And they were concerned that a candidate and they had 2 choices. They didn't need any legal change. They had 2 choices. As a party in Virginia, they could either hold a primary election or they could hold a convention. Well, we were in the middle of a pandemic. They didn't like the idea of holding a convention. That was out. And they were concerned that in a primary, there were 7 candidates who had raised their hand and said they wanted to be the Republican nominee for governor. And they were concerned that a primary process would get the 7 of them taking pot shots at each other. And whoever won would then be presented with those negative statements that his colleagues had made during the primary by the Democrats in the general election. And they thought that was not a good idea. So they really didn't want to do a primary. So they created an alternate convention. They called it an unassembled convention. And they set up locations in, I think, 38 places around the state where people who would have gone to a convention came to a smaller location and were able to cast their votes using ranked choice voting. So you didn't have to sit through hours of no one got a majority, let's try again, which is what typically happens in a convention. So they did this, and as a result, Glenn Youngkin was nominated to be the Republican candidate for governor, and he is now Governor Glenn Youngkin, the first Republican to win statewide office in a while in Virginia. But not only was he elected, the Republicans were able to nominate candidates who not only won in their primary, but were more acceptable to independents and some Democrats in a general election. And Virginia now has a Republican governor, a Republican district attorney, and a Republican lieutenant governor, each of whom was nominated using ranked choice voting. So they were able to receive broad voter support within their party, and that was reflected in their ability to garner broader support in the general election. So to me, that's a great example of nominating candidates who not only survive a primary, but can actually win a general election. So I go back to my original statement. I would like both parties to do that. I want the best candidates who lots of people, lots of voters can support, because chances are they will govern in a way that they will treat all of their constituents as their constituents. So one benefit is you nominate broadly supported candidates. Another benefit is that you get rid of a couple of things. One thing you get rid of is split voting. So I have an example that comes out of Fort Collins, Colorado, but there are other cases where you might have half a dozen candidates in a race, and 4 of them have the same political ideology and one is different. Well, the voters in that jurisdiction might really be represented by the 4 candidates that then split the votes. So the one different ideology candidate winds up winning. Well, but he doesn't reflect the politics of the majority, but because the votes were split among 4 candidates, you wind up nominating someone who's sort of incongruous. So with ranked choice voting, that's not an issue, because people would have ranked those 4 candidates who had similar ideologies, and therefore the one with the very different ideology would not have stood a chance to win. So that's another thing. You get rid of the spoiler effect of splitting votes. Another example of the spoiler effect that you see in our current system is we have a representative from the Harris County area who lost his election by fewer votes than the Libertarian received. So the Democrat got elected because there was a third-party candidate, and third-party candidates, I think, appropriately don't like to be called spoilers. Yeah. They represent an ideology that they advocate for. But if you think about it, they often will attract voters who would have more likely gone either for the Democrat or the Republican. And therefore, if you're looking at broad voter support, the wrong candidate wins because of those votes that get directed to the third-party candidate. So that's not really satisfying for the third-party candidate, and it's very frustrating to the winner, to the guy who loses, because the winner didn't have any votes taken away from them. So that's the next thing that I really like about ranked choice voting. It is nonpartisan. Sometimes the benefit goes to a Democrat, sometimes the benefit goes to the Republican. It all depends on who the other candidates in the race are. But the benefit always goes to the more broadly supported candidate. And to me, that's a real value. We talked about, for military voters, how a benefit of ranked choice voting would be that you wouldn't have to the speed. It saves voters time. You don't have to go back to the polls. It would save the state money. In 2020, it would have saved the state $6.4 million. That money could be used to enhance election integrity. It could be used for anything, but to spend money on a runoff election that tends to have low turnout doesn't seem right. And I think, Lucy, you mentioned that initially, just like it's not very efficient.
Yep.
So saving money would be a good thing. Saving time would be a good thing. It's also, there are people who choose not to run for a position because should they be so fortunate as to get into a runoff, they're not going to have enough money to finance that second campaign. So it not only saves taxpayers money by not having to pay for the runoff election, it enables more people to choose to run because they don't have to worry about the potential incremental cost of an additional election.
Yep.
So, oh, and then my favorite, I forget, this is why I work on ranked choice voting. It decreases campaign animosity. So I'm running against James, and I know that Lucy really thinks James is great, and she's going to vote for him.
Mm-hmm.
But I want her to put me as her second choice. So I'm not going to say really nasty things about James, some of which may or may not even be true, because I don't want to really tick her off. So research has shown that campaigns run in an election with ranked choice voting, the level of civility increases because people don't want to say such nasty things because they want those backup votes. So I think that covers most of the benefits. And again, those benefits are more applicable in some types of elections than in others. Party primaries, really applicable. Special elections, really applicable. Military and overseas voters, really applicable. If a local jurisdiction wants to use it for whatever reason for their nonpartisan election, I prefer to something like cumulative voting, which some school boards use in parts of Texas, where if I'm supposed to elect 5 people, I get 5 votes and I can put all 5 of them on one candidate. That doesn't make sense to me. So there are other benefits that you get with ranked choice voting. So I think,
James, are you convinced yet, or?
I think she laid out her points very well, and I think she makes some persuasive arguments. Unfortunately, though, I do have concerns about it, and I think probably my foremost concern is that it's violative of the American principle that one person has one vote. I worry that that this system is too disruptive to the status quo and really too much of a deviation from the norm, that it would introduce some unintended consequences. And I also worry that RCV disenfranchises voters, because if you look at it, the winner of the contest, there is a real chance for ballot exhaustion within the process, and that the winner of the contest ultimately is only decided by a certain number of voters, meaning that we have the potential for a slug of voters to have their votes effectively set aside and not counted in the process. And so, those are my 2 big concerns. I will say, though, that I do find it appealing that this system could potentially lead to a scenario in which the state saves money, because heaven knows I am a fiscal conservative and I love ideas that save taxpayer money. So, yeah,
well said. Well, let me ask you differently then. Is there another?
May I respond to the one person, one vote? Ranked choice voting does not violate one person, one vote any more than if I vote in an election and then I vote in a runoff election. Is that not one person, one vote? It's the same thing. I get 1 vote per
contest.
Per contest. And the contest, so if we're running for school board or running for state rep, and I've ranked 5 candidates, and the system winds up going through several tallies, in each tally, my vote is only there once. It's like a separate runoff election each time. If you don't count my vote in a runoff election as breaking one person, one vote, then that shouldn't be the case in the instant runoffs that occur with ranked choice voting. And that's really important. So I'm really glad you brought that up. So we have never tested Austin's inability to use ranked choice voting back in 2001, but other states have taken it through their court systems, and it has never been ruled to, let me state that more positively, it has always been ruled to be consistent with one person, one vote. So that's just not an issue. And I think that that's really a matter of educating people as to how it's just like a series of runoff elections. And if I were made to go back to the poll 6 times, each time there was another one of the instant runoff elections, that would not be a violation of one person, one vote. But again, initially it's like, oh my gosh, someone's getting more than one vote. No, he's only getting one vote per runoff election, and there's a whole series of them. So that was important to me to mention.
So James, is there another alternative voting system that you would prefer, or would you like the system as is?
No, I think our preference is for the system as is with tweaks, though, because, one of the things that we've noticed here at the foundation is that voter confidence in election systems is not real high. And in fact, I'd point you to some recent polling done by a lot of different outfits, but Gallup in particular comes to mind. They had a poll out November 2022, which showed that about 2/3 of Americans had trust in the election systems. That was near an all-time low. So, I think there are lots of signals out there that people want some additional security in terms of knowing that the election outcomes have been reached in a free and fair way. And so, I think that's one of the other complications with considering an alternative system like this, is that, at the end of the day, would it produce the sort of outcomes that people would be more comfortable with? I don't think so. And one reason why is that under RCV, it's harder to track. It's harder for the average person to track how the outcomes were reached, because you have the potential to go through so many rounds of redistributing votes, right? And so, I think that's why we would prefer some additional transparency and accountability measures be instituted within the current framework so as to shore up confidence in the system.
So can you give me examples of the tweaks? How would you make it more secure?
Yeah, so, one of the issues that we saw down in Harris County was, in one example, and Harriet, I'm sure will know this well, there were a number of voting locations that ran out of paper ballots on election day. I quite frankly find that to be inexcusable. And there were some penalties considered at the legislature for political subdivisions who engaged in those sort of shenanigans, or at least allowed those circumstances to emerge. Another Harris County specific bill basically got rid of the election administrator who was acting as an obstacle to people who were interested in knowing how the outcomes were reached, and the responsibilities of that office were effectively devolved into the tax assessor, collector, and I believe it was the county clerk. So, that is another safety precaution that was taken within the existing framework to kind of ferret out some of the shenanigans that are happening locally. Harriet, actually, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you mentioned something earlier that I think also ought to be considered at the legislative level, and that's to consolidate some of these elections in the November timeframe in particular, where you have the greatest number of voters participating in the election, so that with a fair amount of certainty that those are the candidates that voters want, as opposed to having either specially called elections or off-cycle elections where not a lot of people are participating. And hopefully I didn't mischaracterize that, Harriet. But
no, I think that's right. And there were a bunch of bills introduced this year to do just that, to get more elections to be held in November. I honestly don't know how many of those passed, but increasing the percentage of our population that votes would be a good thing. And I share your concern about large changes all at once, but I think that testing ranked choice voting in the types of elections where it could have the largest value and doing it, I've been going around talking about bite-sized pieces for the last couple of years, but doing it in bite-sized pieces, let us try it. I know that it works in fill in the blank state, Utah, a Republican state, or California, a Democratic state. But we Texans like to see it ourselves and make sure we feel comfortable with it. So let's just try it and see if it provides any benefits. If it doesn't provide benefits, we don't have to expand it. If voters like it, if the candidates like it, and if we see that it really does increase voter confidence in the system. Going back to the election that I had in mind when I was talking about 4 people of one ideology and 1 person of another, that happened in Fort Collins, Colorado, a couple of years ago. And everyone knew that the election was rigged. Because how could that guy who really doesn't represent what our community likes, how could he win? Well, he won because there were 4 candidates that split the votes. So there are some things that would really increase voters' confidence in elections that ranked choice voting could bring about. And then the business about having 23 candidates in a special election and leaving the seat open for so long, it just doesn't make sense. There are clearly places where we should be doing this. We should be protecting our military voters. Let's just try a couple of these and see how we like it. And it's really important, saying that no system is perfect and each one has its flaws. Somehow we have to get beyond the misinformation that gets spread by both left and right media and really try to talk about the facts and see how we in the aggregate, people all across the political spectrum, can improve the situation and make voters feel better about our democracy.
How concerned should we be about election fraud? I think that topic has been constant in the media since the 2016 elections, when there were talks about Russian influence on our elections. Do you think that there is election fraud in American elections?
I think we ought to be very concerned about the perception of election fraud.
Yeah.
Whether or not election fraud occurs is almost secondary in my mind to I would say the view held by a lot of Americans that there's a lot of funny business in our elections. And so, it's another reason why I think we need to make the entire process a bit more transparent so that people can track their vote from the time it's cast till the time it's counted. And then we have a very understandable and systematic way of knowing how the results were reached. And so, for that reason, I would argue for simplicity within the election system.
And I would agree with everything you say. I do think there is voter fraud, but not of a magnitude that would actually influence most elections. I've only seen one election, I think, in North Carolina ever that is quoted as there was enough election fraud to actually change the outcome. Mm-hmm. But we have to be very concerned. And I just wish we could tone down the rhetoric, because it is not healthy to get Americans to distrust our voting system. And our voting system is largely okay in terms of prevention of fraud.
I agree with you. Do you think that perhaps in the future we could look at voting through our phones? Is that an option? Would that be viable?
I think eventually technology does transform the way we participate in American-style democracy. I think for me, what I'd want to see come alongside that is some sort of auditing process to make sure that, everybody is comfortable with how these jurisdictions are getting from point A to point B, and that we're really we're being vigilant about any potential problems that could arise from an over-reliance on technology.
Yeah.
Again, I go back to that issue of, there's a large segment of the public that perceives there to be a problem, even if there may not be one that we can identify directly. There's just a lot of folks have a gut feeling about this thing, and it's important that we put that to rest with the proper transparency and accountability mechanisms.
And why is yeah? Go on.
And get people across the political spectrum to talk about the measures that are in place to prevent fraud, rather than trying to inflame the situation. And that's a very Pollyanna-ish statement on my part, but boy, if we just tone down the rhetoric, it would really help so much.
So why is the media driving this rhetoric? Why are they making us distrust the system more?
Well, I think it's clickbait in a lot of ways. I think these media outlets utilize hyperbole so as to get eyes on their content. And unfortunately, I don't see how you change that other than through a robust education effort on the part of a lot of groups like ours, 501c3s, in addition to, again, making sure that the process is transparent and accountable, and that we're doing everything we can to hold bad actors to account.
Well said.
It's really just a different permutation of, if it bleeds, it leads. That's what sells newspapers. And I am a capitalist. I was a banker for 27 years. I'm a conservative banker. And I understand what financial incentives are all about. But we really need to tone down the rhetoric and not stir up distrust for things that are basic to our existence.
Yes, I think the 2024 elections will be very interesting.
I hope they will be secure. I hope we.
Yeah. Okay. I think we covered most of it. Is there anything else you would like to say around ranked choice voting, alternative voting methods?
I definitely think it is worth a try in Texas to see what benefits it can produce and avoid some of the problems that exist with our current system. And it is being increasingly tried in other jurisdictions around the country, both red and blue. And we should all be aiming for something that works well.
Well said.
Well, I would agree, Harriet. This is a concept that is being discussed, I would say, a bit more widely within Texas public policy circles. And so look forward to being just a small part of any future conversation on this issue, because I think it's very interesting at a minimum.
Well,
look forward to it. Thanks, Lucy.
Thank you both for coming on the podcast and having this important conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Okay.